And we now have the final plenary session. We've got 4 speakers lined up to speak to you, and they're going to talk to us about the main challenges to delivering net zero, the bottlenecks and barriers. We have our first speaker. So I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Nick Eyre. He's based at the University of Oxford and is a professor of energy and climate policy, the director of CREDS, and co-director of the Oxford Martin Programme on integrating renewable energy. He was the lead author, or a lead author, of the Buildings chapter on the mitigation report of the 5th assessment of the IPCC, and a review editor in the 6th assessment. He has 35 years of experience on energy issues and has worked in a number of different sectors, including Oxford City Council, where he's currently the climate change advisor. He's also a fellow of the Energy Institute and previously at Energy Saving Trust. So over to Nick.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and it's nice to be with you all this morning. So my pitch, if you want to put it that way, this morning is very simple in terms of the barriers and bottlenecks to net zero, and it is that we need to pay more attention to how we use energy, how much energy we use, and what sort of energy we use. And if we don't do that, we probably won't get to net zero. Next slide, please. So Sarah's briefly introduced CREDS. We're the hub for energy demand research in the UK, a distributed centre with more than 20 universities involved. We are now reaching the end of our work programme. We end next year, and that means we've been doing some thinking about recently about how best to convey our results, not just to research audiences, but to wider audiences. Next slide, please. So we are a fairly typical hub research centre. We have 9 themes, which you can see on this slide. I'm not going to go through them in detail. 3 relate to the major sectors of energy use, 3 to some cross-cutting issues, and 3 to particular challenges. But as the sort of messy diagram at the bottom shows, these interact quite a lot, and we don't think the best way to present our results for general audiences is necessarily in this thematic way. Next slide, please. So we have been working on how to better present what we found. There's a lot more information on this on the web link at the bottom, which is essentially a relaunch of our website done last week to present our research findings in these 15 categories. Fear not, I'm not going to go through all 15 this morning. I'm going to stick briefly to the 4 that are indicated in green. But the message is fairly straightforward. If you go to there's a web page for each of these 15. If you go to that, you get a very simple storyline about what the key messages are, but you also get access to all the research findings that we've produced over the last 4 years. Warning, that's 400 publications, including 200 journal articles. That's why we want to synthesize the research findings in this way. So some key messages. Next slide, please. The first is that improving energy efficiency and reducing demand has multiple benefits. The right-hand side there is a diagram taken straight from the International Energy Agency, who agree with us. Clearly, energy efficiency can contribute not just to reducing carbon emissions, but to making energy services more affordable and to improving energy security. And anybody who doesn't think that affordability and security aren't important must have been asleep for the last few months. Worth adding that we also know that improving energy efficiency has a lot of other benefits. Warmer homes, less congested streets, cleaner air, better diets, more active lifestyles. And many of these offer very significant health benefits, which for many people may be a more convincing driver for action than carbon emissions reduction. Particularly in the transport sector, huge scope for reducing air pollution. and particularly in the building sector, energy efficiency investment has a much higher propensity to create jobs locally. Next slide, please. The key point in many ways is that the potential for reducing energy use is not a minor issue. It is very large. Over the last 30 years, our research shows that energy efficiency has played the largest role in reducing UK emissions, although policies have weakened a lot in the last decade, probably improved a bit in the last week, so we're beginning to get more hopeful. So we think reducing demand will be central to delivering the UK's net zero commitments, and that it can be reduced in all of the main sectors: transport, buildings and industry. Electrification will play a key role in that. Clearly, heat pumps and electric vehicles are much more efficient than the technologies that they replace. And the detailed work led by CREDS colleague John Barrett that we've done over the last few years has shown that we can halve demand for energy in the UK by 2050 and get down to a level of energy use which is below the current global average, which has very strong implications for the global situation. Essentially means that the world can reduce emissions and live at Western European standards of living. Next slide. It's important to think about energy use in the context of the whole energy system. It's affected by the wider energy system, and it affects the wider energy system. We know that future supply will be dominated by variable renewable energy. We know that that is electricity, and therefore we not only need to reduce overall demand, we need to increase the flexibility of its time of use, and we need to switch to decarbonised fuels. So it's not just an insulation agenda for too long. Too many people still think of energy efficiency as being about insulation. It's much broader than that. It's about changing how much energy we use, when we use it, and what sort of energy we use. Last slide, please. And that means that engaging people in the transition is crucial. People are critical as users of energy, as citizens and voters, and as workers. If you think about the two crucial transitions I mentioned to heat pumps and electric vehicles, they are going to depend on shifts in consumer purchasing behaviour. But it's really important not to run away with the idea that changes to consumer behaviour are what can drive the energy transition, and that they're an alternative to other forms of action. We will only get those changes in consumer behaviour through changes in infrastructure, regulation and incentives. In other words, we get demand side change in much the same way that policy delivers supply side change. It is not viable to think of changing people's behaviour as an activity of changing 60 million people's attitudes one by one. And hopefully, as new industries emerge, we will create highly skilled jobs in those industries, particularly in construction. That's needed, and create that new workforce can, I think, actually be one of the main drivers of change. We see a lot of the resistance to change comes from people in incumbent industries. If we can develop new industries, then they are pressures that they will create drivers for change. So I'll end there, Sarah. Look forward to the other speakers and the question session.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I'm now delighted to introduce Professor Rob Gross, who has managed to join us. Well done, Rob. Sorry for the confusion. So Rob is the director of UKERC, UK Energy Research Centre. Prior to this, he was the director for the Centre for Energy Policy and Technology, or ICET, at Imperial College London, policy director of Imperial's Energy Futures Lab, and co-director at UKERC. He has wide-ranging research management expertise and has made a substantive contribution to UK energy policy development. He's been involved in various select committees, prepared reports, and chaired committees to government departments and non-departmental bodies as a consultant. He was seconded to the Cabinet Office in the early 2000s and contributed to the Blair Government Energy Review. So welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Sarah. Can I just check first of all that I've got a bit of an echo actually, but can you hear me all right? Thanks. The online people can. I hope that you can hear me in the auditorium as well. Nick was also seconded to the Cabinet Office and worked on the Blair government's energy review. I just thought I should probably get that in right at the very outset, since we've gone back into the mists of time that far. I don't have slides for you this morning, partly because I had some domestic issues here that prevented me from getting them to the organisers in time, but also because I thought you might have had enough of slides. I can certainly get some facts and figures to you all that underline the point that I'm going to be making. Challenges to delivering the decarbonisation or bottlenecks and issues. I don't disagree with anything that Nick said. I never disagree with Nick. Just going to put that into the conversation as well. However, so I'm going to talk about the UK context as well. Even if we deliver the 50% reduction in total demand for energy that Nick just described, we would still need to roughly double the amount of electricity that we provide, and we will need to move all of that electricity to low carbon sources. So what I'm going to be putting to you today is that ongoing decarbonisation of electricity is a major challenge, and it's a challenge that we're in danger of underestimating the significance of. The reason that we're in danger of underestimating that challenge is it's a good reason in a way, which is, well, it's probably two good reasons. The first is that electricity decarbonisation has been extremely successful over the last 2 decades. So we've roughly halved the carbon intensity of electricity generation from something of about 400 to 500 grams per kilowatt hour on average to below 200. And on windy days, when demand is fairly low, or on windy and sunny days, our electricity grams per kilowatt hour can sometimes dip below 100 grams per kilowatt hour, which was the Climate Change Committee's target for electricity generation a few years ago before we adopted net zero. At the moment, if you're interested enough, there's a couple of online sources where you can look at what the grid is doing in terms of where we're getting our electricity from and carbon intensity and price. For the last few days, we've been burning an awful lot of gas. The renewables output has been very low, and both the price and carbon emissions have been relatively high. But the carbon emissions are still about half what they were a few years ago, let's say 20 years ago, when Nick and I were working in the Cabinet Office. And the reason for that is that if you go back to 1990, we got about 20% of our electricity from nuclear and about 80% of our electricity from coal. Then during the 1990s, not for carbon reasons, but for other reasons that we could discuss another time, we built a ton of gas, a lot of gas-fired power stations. It was called Dash for Gas. And since around about 2000 or so, mainly because of that incredibly successful energy review that Nick and I co-authored, there's been an awful lot of it. That was a joke. There's been an awful lot of expansion of renewables, most notably in the last few years, offshore wind. But prior to that, a big rollout of onshore wind. We've also got one large biomass power station that runs, and we've done a bunch of solar and other things as well. What's happened in the last 5 years, perhaps 7 years in addition to that, is that several of those leading renewables options have got much, much cheaper. So we are now in a situation where the most recently connected offshore wind farms, for example, that have what's called a contract for difference to provide electricity for the grid, which is at a fixed price, are helping to keep the price of electricity down. Unfortunately, not very many of our existing renewables schemes have that particular contract, and the others are not really helping to keep prices down. And that's one of the reasons that the government has imposed a windfall tax on nuclear and renewables, because the price of gas is very high, So the price of electricity is very high, and it's above what we thought, what was needed, even when those more expensive, older wind farms were built. So renewables, we've been building them. We've got something like 30 to 40% of our electricity is coming from renewables, and then on top of that, we've got some nuclear. So we've got something like 60% of our electricity from low carbon sources on the GB system at the moment. And the danger is that because we've got that far, we make the mistake of thinking that it's not a problem to build more. And then we compound that by becoming preoccupied by second order issues in the electricity system, like, for example, should we move to locational marginal pricing, which I won't try and explain, but which is loved by economists and detested by renewables developers in Scotland. I'll characterise it in that way. So there is a danger that we think that decarbonising electricity is kind of done, that renewables are so cheap that the market will build them by themselves without intervention from the government, and that rather than focusing on continuing to roll out lots of low carbon power, we should be thinking about how to optimize the use of the power grid and think about market-based solutions for this, that, and the other, which I'm not against, and which have some benefits. But we still have to deliver, according to Climate Change Committee or National Grid figures, something of the order of at least 10, perhaps 15 billion pounds per year of investment in low carbon sources for several decades. We had a 30 gigawatt offshore wind target. We now have a 50 gigawatt offshore wind target. That means we have something like 5 times as much offshore wind installed. And that's just one of the examples. Offshore wind, according to some scenarios, will be providing as much electricity on its own as we currently generate, but from all sources by the mid-2030s to meet our targets. Now, I'm not saying that this can't be done. I very, very strongly believe it can be done, but we shouldn't underestimate the significance of the investment that's required and the scale of that challenge. Other renewables will be, most people believe, variable renewables will be the main provider of electricity because of the cost reductions that we've seen, and because there really isn't another show in town that looks as if it's going to do it. We will build some nuclear power stations. We could have a conversation about whether we could ever realistically build a power station a year, as one of our former prime ministers promised we would. And we can do a bit of stuff with carbon capture and storage, but if it's on gas, that currently doesn't look very attractive because gas is very expensive. Now that could change and the gas price could come back down, but variable renewables are still the major show in town. Because they're variable, and I will stop in a moment, because they're variable, we also need to manage that variability. There are various means of doing that, but what I'm going to put into the conversation is, yes, we can do demand response, and yes, we can do interconnection and all sorts of clever things to manage variability, but we almost certainly also need bulk energy storage to help us to manage through those low wind periods, low solar periods, like now, that stretch for several days in order to keep the system going. Now I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. So as you can see, there's not just one solution, and that's the whole point of being at a conference like this, where different people will tell us about their different solutions. So with that, I'm very delighted to introduce Dr. Emily Cox. She's a researcher at the University of Oxford in Smith School, and is part of Core 2 Greenhouse Gas Removal Hub. She's a researcher at Cardiff, working on projects for UKERC as well, and is part of the Leverhulme Centre for Climate Change Research. She is interested in public participation and democracy in climate policy and practice, and has been involved in many aspects of greenhouse gas removal, including unconventional hydrocarbons. She's also worked in a number of different sectors, having previously worked for the Royal Academy of Engineering, for E.ON, which is an energy company for anyone who doesn't know, and for Greenpeace in the UK. So welcome, Emily.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and yeah, apologies that I can't be there in person. And also notice the error on the title slide. Apparently, I don't know what month it is, so that's always a good start. Yeah, so next slide, please. So I was asked here to talk about public attitudes and public participation, but then thinking about, what are the barriers and challenges to delivering net zero? I think it's worth taking a step back. And something I'd like to talk about is this net in net zero, right? Lest we forget, meeting net zero requires the removal of previously emitted greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. This isn't just reducing the emissions that we produce, it's actually removing the emissions that are already out there. And the IPCC was fairly unequivocal on this point. You need it partly in order to compensate for hard to abate sectors. So this includes things like agriculture and international shipping. This graph on the left that I hope you can see, this is from the Committee on Climate Change in the UK. This is their balanced pathway to net zero. And essentially the bit that I'm talking about is this bright green wedge down the bottom. And you can see that all of the other colours are the emissions reductions in all of these other sectors. And yet in order to meet this net zero, we still need this green wedge down the bottom. Now, there are many different options for carbon removal, and the typology that's on the bottom right-hand corner is essentially just an illustration of the diversity and the complexity of the field. There are a huge number of proposals out there that used very, very, very different mechanisms, both for capturing and for storing the carbon. I think on Rob's point about investment, the thing is a lot of these are extremely novel, and many of them are not proven at scale. And the type of scale of investment that we're going to require to bring these to the kind of scale where we can meet those kind of green wedges is fairly large indeed, right? Saying that, despite the complexity of the field, the most discussed options for carbon removal generally fall into two camps, right? First of all, you've got proposals that store CO2 in biological matter. So this is trees, soils, things like this. Many of these are more well developed than other proposals. They include things like planting trees, which we've been doing at scale for many decades. However, the problem with these is that they tend to store the carbon for a much shorter period of time, and they're much more vulnerable to disturbance. And if you cut down the tree, it's no longer storing the carbon, right? The other sort of camp of proposals involve storing the CO2 underground in geological formations. A lot of these involve techniques that are related to carbon capture and storage. And these kind of have the opposite problem in that we're not currently doing them at scale, but they provide the potential, if we could prove it at scale, the potential to store carbon securely and in a way that we can quite easily monitor how much is going in and how much is staying in for a very, very long time in the future. Next slide, please. But yeah, as I said, the thing I was asked to talk about was public attitudes to greenhouse gas removal. And I'm sorry about the formatting on this slide here. I don't know what's happened there. But essentially, we know that public attitudes are crucial for technology development and upscaling. I hope that sentence doesn't come as a surprise to anybody here. I would argue that there is little evidence currently that public attitudes are constituting a major barrier to the upscaling of greenhouse gas removal in the vast majority of countries. However, that comes with a caveat in that publics are not just a barrier. Right? We did some work a while ago. We looked at how experts conceptualize the public when they're talking about innovation. Everyone's so negative about it, and everyone talks about publics as a barrier and an opposition and a problem that they need to get around. Right? Publics can be a vital enabler of new technologies, new innovations. They can provide vital demand pull. And in this respect, for carbon removal, we're not seeing much in the way of positive either. So they're not really a barrier, but we're not seeing much of an enabling role. When we talk to people about it, we see a lot of conditional acceptance. We see a lot of reluctant acceptance. We know that broadly speaking, across a vast number of technologies, Attitudes are determined by certain things, and amongst the most important of these are people's values, their beliefs, and their identity. But we also know that local context will be crucial. This is things like the history and culture of the area, and also how well something fits with the landscape in which it's actually proposed to go into. We also often hear this line that if you do something offshore, it will be more supported. There is in terms of CO2 removal and CO2 storage, there is very little evidence that that is the case. We know that proximity to a storage site is not a strong predictor of people's attitudes. However, country differences do matter. So, for example, someone in Germany is far more likely to be against it than someone in Norway, and so forth. Next slide, please. So whilst saying all of this, I think it's important to consider what could become a barrier, right? And from this respect, there's a lot we can learn from previous controversies. We know that aspects relating to procedural and distributional justice are absolutely crucial. This is questions about how something is done rather than what is done. And it's questions about who wins and who loses, and who and what is all of this for, right? And we find that these questions really underlie the vast majority of narratives that we find when we speak to people about these things. On that notion of who's it all for, it's really important to have a consistent climate policy. It's really important to avoid mixed messages and to avoid perceptions that all of this is just an excuse to continue high emissions elsewhere in the economy, particularly for certain segments of society that emit more than others, right? I also often come across this thing that we call the information deficit hypothesis. And this is the idea that people don't know very much about science and technology. They're not familiar with most of these ideas. Therefore, what we need to do is we need to educate people, right? We need to communicate to them about how great all of this stuff is, and we need to educate them, and then they will think more like we do, right? We know from a great amount of research that this is not the case. This does not work in practice. I'm not saying education's a bad thing. Obviously, it's something that's good in and of itself, but it's not going to perform this instrumental role of getting you where you want to be. And I think, honestly, these kinds of ideas about how we just need to give people more information are holding us back from a bit of a more productive role for publics and a bit of a more productive role for public engagement. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. I also got asked to talk about public participation. I'm very aware that in the UK Energy Research Centre, I am not the foremost expert in participation. For that, you need to go to UEA. But I have some general points about this. So firstly, I mean, participation's not a silver bullet. You can't just assume that, oh, we'll do more participation and then we'll get the outcomes that we want, because that's really not how it works. Saying that, it is a good start. And we know that it's important to engage with people early, it's important to engage continuously, and it's important to engage with a really diverse and hopefully inclusive range of people. And part of the reason for this is because there's a huge amount that you can gain from using local knowledge. We tend to be quite narrow in our view of what knowledge actually is and what it means. And we know that there are a huge number of very diverse forms of knowledge, and these can actually lead to better technology outcomes, better policy outcomes if you utilize them. We find that currently approaches to participation are extremely ad hoc. Different projects, different proposals are doing them in very, very different ways. The risk of this, as we've shown with some other work we've done, is that all it takes is for one thing to get it wrong and for one thing to create a big controversy, and you can end up with extremely damaging spillover effects onto public perceptions across a wide range of technologies and even potentially other sectors. And so we basically argue that it would be beneficial to have a bit of a more systematic approach to participation. And one idea that we came up with was to have citizens' assemblies for multiple different techniques, for multiple different scenarios, and at multiple different scales. The reason I've underlined the word meaningful on my slide is that these need to go somewhere, right? You need to have a viable route for the recommendations that people are coming up with from these citizen assemblies to actually influence policy, to actually go somewhere. Because otherwise you end up with this kind of pseudo participation that in some cases can actually be worse than no participation at all. And so a lot of this is what we're trying to do in our project, right? We're trying to make use of what we're calling social intelligence, and we're trying to embed it in all kinds of different ways across our project. And so amongst other things, what we're doing is we're embedding participation in work that we're doing to evaluate different greenhouse gas removal ideas and in how to decide who should get funded. I'll wrap up there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, I'm delighted to invite Uttara Narayan to speak. She is based with us at the University of Oxford and is a researcher for CREDS. Oh, sorry. I thought someone was talking to me there. Yeah, she's doing some research to look at the intersections between racial justice and energy demand in the UK, with the aim of developing a research agenda in this area. And before that, she worked in India at the World Resources Institute on energy and governance, where she was working on incorporating social justice perspectives into the clean energy transition and energy access. So over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. So in this presentation, I'm not going to make a case for why justice needs to be considered, but rather what kinds of articulations of justice are required as we move along the transition. So next slide, please. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm making two arguments, one using India as an example and highlighting some of its barriers to delivering net zero. I will make a case for why we need a broader interpretation of what a just transition should entail. And the second example will be from the UK, where informed by our ongoing scoping work as part of CREDS, I make the case for us energy researchers to consider racial justice more actively in our work. So let's start with India, where I'm from. And as Sarah mentioned, I've looked at aspects of electricity governance and equity across the national and subnational level. So next slide, please. So here's a quick background and a highly abridged timeline of India's climate and energy milestones. Why does India matter? It's at the moment, according to IEA, the third largest producer and consumer of energy in the world. And as you can see here, its commitment to achieving net zero is by 2070, which sitting in December 2022 seems quite a far way along. But in the meantime, it has set medium-term goals, which, as you can see from 2022 and 2030 milestones, are significantly supply-driven, and these are supply-side capacity additions through renewable resources. And there's also a massive reliance on solar as the renewable energy technology. Climate Action Tracker has given India's NDC targets an overall rating of highly insufficient. Now, why would that be the case? Next slide, please. And here I'm going to present three barriers from the perspective of equity. This is, of course, not exhaustive, but it hopefully gives all of us a glimpse into the challenges ahead, especially when we think about some of the justice concerns that Emily mentioned and what Nick also talked about in terms of where people are located when we think about delivering net zero. And so here you can see from the three panels that the first explanation that I'm going to give is around India's complicated entanglements with coal as it continues to build its coal capacity. And this is also one of the reasons that Climate Action Tracker has given for giving it the label of highly insufficient. The second is around universal electrification and electricity access, which is an important SDG 7 goal. And the third is around what a just transition means when your net zero strategy is highly reliant on large-scale renewable energy. So if we focus on the first panel on coal, India's relationship with coal is complicated. And as I said, we continue to open new coal mines and thermal power plants. Electricity generation and coal mining is dominated by nationalized companies, which are also predominantly funded by public sector banks. So you can see that the coal sector is deeply entrenched in India's public finance machinery. There's a lot of in-depth analyses on the dependence on revenue from coal and the employment in the sector. And I won't get too much into those details, but I want to give you one example just to show you how sort of deep these entanglements run. And that's the example of looking at another sector, which is the Indian Railways. Now, the railways are one of the most affordable public transport systems that a majority of Indians are dependent on. And this is thanks to its highly subsidized passenger fares. Now, this subsidization is possible because the Indian Railways overcharges freight costs that it levies on coal companies for transporting coal across the country. So when we're thinking of a coal phase out, we need to anticipate and plan for the shocks that India's public finance infrastructure is going to face, and also rethink more fundamentally our existing models of welfare that rely on revenue from coal across various levels of governance. So it's not just a sort of coal sector specific strategy that's there. The second panel that you can see, and here I'm going to focus on energy use and electricity access. India's per capita energy use remains less than the global average, no surprises there. However, there is significant inequality in the energy consumption and the quality of service across regions. Achieving universal electrification has been a long-standing political goal, and the Ministry of Power actually claims, as you can see from the image there, it claims 99.9% electrification of households that express their willingness to be electrified before March 2019. Now, this interesting definition of willingness to be electrified aside, there's another important factor to consider, because we need to think about electrification merely beyond providing a power supply connection to a household. So significant work is still required to identify and scale models around, what is affordable and what is sustainable to ensure good quality power supply that can effectively respond to the demand of the underserved. And by quality of power supply, I'm talking about things like maintaining the voltage level, minimizing the frequency of power outages to ensure that, that service is provided effectively. And the final panel on the right-hand side, right? And as I mentioned in the previous slide, India's clean energy transition and climate commitments are dominated by a strategy of electricity capacity expansion through large-scale solar. This is becoming the undisputed template for India's energy transition. However, it's also important to recognize that these are extremely intense. These are sort of land and water intensive technologies. Solar panels need to be cleaned regularly with fresh water to maintain their efficiency. They also need large amounts of land to generate the equivalent power in comparison to traditional power plants because of the relatively lower power density. Now, the consequences of these are recognized, but what's also important is how this is engaged with and negotiated at the local level, especially at the sites of these installations. So therefore, framing of just transition should not be limited to a transition away from coal, which is also important, but it also needs to handle the consequences of a transition towards renewables and low carbon alternatives. Next slide, please. So this point about a transition towards low carbon alternatives now leads us to the case of the UK, where also we need to ensure that our transition to net zero is equitable. So as you can see here, I am making a very solid case because I'm quoting from this paper, this editorial that was published in Nature about 2 years ago. So, Nature has published this editorial, so that's a solid argument. But yeah, so now that I have convinced you that, racial justice is very important using this citation, what could that actually look like? So next slide, please. So first, for us to understand what racial justice could look like, we need to explore if and how the energy system is racialized. So here you see, I'm not sure if you can sort of see the broader sort of box that is there. But the first is actually if you look at it at a structural level, not just relevant to the energy system, but also beyond that in terms of society at large, we do see varying degrees of evidence of a differentiated access to services or how vulnerable different people are. So just to give you a few examples, one, the cost of living crisis at the moment, you see that especially ONS data demonstrates how Black and Black British adults are, more percentage of them are unable to cope with the cost of living crisis in comparison to their white British counterparts. There is sort of diverse evidence on how people from ethnic minority backgrounds access public services, be it around language barriers when it comes to obtaining consumer advice or a reluctance to avail state benefits that they may actually be eligible for. And similarly, there's various research that demonstrates differentiated access to decent houses, green spaces, or where public transport is provided and the degree of reliance on that. Now, these examples, of course, are not exhaustive, but they provide some examples of how social experiences and relationships can be racialized and therefore could impact your well-being. Now, if we then, from a societal level, if we now focus on the energy system, could that demonstrate similar differences in access to services and well-being? So here I present to you some questions based on how the current energy system is set up. First, who is considered a typical energy user, and what does that mean for those who might not fit that definition of a typical energy user? Do we understand the complex and diverse energy needs and practices of people from ethnic minority backgrounds? How responsive or inelastic could those practices be to low carbon lifestyles? And why does using energy for different purposes matter, and therefore whose energy use matters? And finally, is there sufficient representation of energy professionals from ethnic minority backgrounds, and could that affect the way we approach problems and design solutions as we move along towards delivering net zero? Next slide, please. Now, obviously, what I've done in the second part is, just provided more questions, and we don't have the answers to all of this yet. And that is why, as Sarah also mentioned earlier, we are developing a research agenda that is able to contextualize the existing gaps in the way race, ethnicity, and ancestry features in energy research, and also come up with analytical approaches to understand the relationship between energy demand and race. That's it. Thank you.
Great, brilliant. We are running behind, but we do have time for a few questions. So if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, someone will bring you a microphone. Please stand up so people can see you, introduce yourself, and say which consortium you're a part of. We also might have a couple of questions online, so we'll handle those too. So if you just put your hand up if you have a question. This one over there.
Chris Holdsworth from UKCCS. It's a question that's probably more relevant to the first two speakers, but I was just wondering, on the subject of energy, green hydrogen is spoken about a lot in hydrogen, seawater, renewables. One of the caveats is often put with that is it's very inefficient to do do so. So I just wondered, with the amount of offshore wind that's forecast to come on stream in the UK over decades, will we ever get to a place where green hydrogen production from that surplus renewable energy would actually replace essentially gas in our energy mix?
Thanks very much. Over to you, Nick and Rob. Can we go on to, so we can see the speakers rather than the slides?
Sorry, Sarah, I really didn't hear the question. The feedback was too strong.
I think the question was, the gist of the question is, will we reach a stage where we can produce enough green hydrogen to replace gas?
Yeah, based on offshore winds.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Just for future questions, you need to do something about the echo or the feedback, because we can't hear it. It's really impossible, almost impossible to hear.
I'll take you to the nodding.
So, I mean, Nick, I'll just give my answer very quickly. So the scale of use of green hydrogen in the future energy system is something that I'm not sure we quite know yet. I think that there is hydrogen has the potential to be extremely useful for various applications, including aspects of industrial decarbonisation, possibly for as a kind of buffer or energy storage medium. We could certainly be making it with surplus renewables. Will it replace gas in the current energy system? Well, not on the volume and scale that we use gas at the moment. I just don't think that's achievable, either blue or green hydrogen, for economic reasons. And I think we need to be very clear about which sectors we are directly electrifying. We then need to work out the role that hydrogen can play, and we need to do more to prove hydrogen for energy usage at scale, if we are to realise the potential opportunity that it provides. It is unquestionably potentially very useful in a decarbonised future world, but I wouldn't want to run away with the idea that it's a very, a panacea. That's it.
So,
Nick, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Rob said. I mean, what Rob said or implied earlier is that renewables can supply the whole of UK energy demand in future, and I agree with that, with all the caveats that Rob made in what he said. But certainly not replacing the whole of gas use with hydrogen. The biggest use of gas is for heating buildings. I suspect that green hydrogen or any sort of hydrogen will have a relatively, even very small role in that, because it's just a much less efficient way of producing heat than a heat pump, right? And that's, you always need to go back to this question of what is the most efficient way to supply the particular demand. And if we're talking about buildings, it's insulate them properly, and then use your knowledge of the second law of thermodynamics to design sensible heating devices. It's not rocket science.
Thanks, Nick. We're going to do an online question, so I'm just going to hand over to Emma to do that.
Thanks, guys. Yes, we've got a question from Louise King, who's online, and it's a question for Emily. And she says, thinking about public participation in transitions to net zero, how practically could we move towards overcoming potential skepticism towards participation and delivering meaningful outcomes? Emily, did you hear that?
Yes, I did. Yeah, thanks ever so much. Skepticism towards participation. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think part of it is just that I think that people will believe it when they see it. And so we need to be actually making efforts to deliver on this. And I don't really think that that's something that we've done at all so far. I think there are a huge number of efforts to understand what people think about X, Y, Z. But by and large, nothing happens to the outcomes of these projects. They just sit in a report somewhere. And also people don't know it's happening. And these are two gigantic missed opportunities here, right? The Climate Assembly in the UK had very low awareness from people that it was actually even happening at all, despite the fact that David Attenborough was involved, right? Whereas the one that the French did had a huge majority of the French population who were aware that it was happening. And so I think that there are lessons that we can learn there. Because if people see that others are being asked for their participation, for their views, and they see that something is then happening with the outcomes, I think that some of that skepticism decreases. What then, of course, happened with the French one was that they went back on their commitment to act on the recommendations. And that is something that you kind of need to avoid doing, because that contributes to skepticism in a massive way. So yeah, just get on with it, better publicity, and keep our promises.
It doesn't sound like rocket science either. Any more questions in the room? There are two here and one over there. So if we can bring that over here.
Hello, hi. My name is Abdulaziz. I'm with the IEGHG. My question is to Emily. Emily, you did mention that constant communication, engaging the public over and over again does not necessarily bring the public on board on the pathway to net zero. May I ask you, what does work?
Sorry, I caught about half of the words in that. Could somebody on the podium paraphrase?
Yes, indeed. So he basically said, what does work to convince the public to get onto the pathway to net zero?
Well, I mean, I believe in participation, right? So I don't think we should be convincing the public at all. I think we should be asking the public what works in a meaningful sense for them in a just way. And that should be our starting point, right? I think, as I said in the presentation, we have a very particular form of knowledge. We tend to prioritize certain things. And going back to the question about hydrogen, we did a small piece of work on public perceptions of green hydrogen, which we published as a UKERC blog, and we found, unsurprisingly, that the most favourable opinions towards it were generally from high-income men, right? And so obviously there's a question in my mind about whether we're promoting things that appeal to the particular types of knowledge that we tend to prioritize, right? And so I don't think it should really be a case of convincing people of anything. I'm sorry, I know that kind of dodged your question a little bit, and I know that that's not an easy answer to do in practice, but.
We're going to ask questions from the podium now, so that's everyone has a moment in the spotlight, and the sound is better.
Okay, thank you. I think my question is more related to the second panel about the electricity market, because like I have one question about, because he just mentioned that now renewable represent more than 60% of the electricity share in the market. But the problem here is that the electricity price is still determined by maybe the gas prices. So I wonder, is there any reflection about the way that the electricity price should be set in the way that reflect the composition of the electricity? Because now it seems like the consumer he's not even affected by this renewable increase, because we have now like higher production of renewable, but consumer don't even feel it. This higher share of renewable is not reflected in the price. So how can we set the electricity price in the way that reflect the higher share of renewable in the electricity? So that is my question. Thank you. I'm Abdul from Strathclyde University, working in the Center for Energy Policy and also involved in UKCCSRC's project. Thank you.
Okay, did you hear that question?
Yeah, it was a great question.
You said it was for you, Rob, but it's also be for you, Emily.
No, Rob.
Sorry, the host has muted me. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you perfectly. Okay,
yeah, no, it's a really very good and clear question. It's one that we would be able to devote most of the rest of the afternoon to, I'm sure. As many of you might be aware, over the summer, BEIS ran a consultation called Review of Electricity Market Arrangements, which has actually got a longer term focus and was initiated before we saw the crisis and the kind of 500% increase in gas prices, which fed through into electricity prices. UKERC's proposition that we put out in a briefing paper in the spring that would have, which has the potential to take something of the order of £20 billion financial flow away from those generators that are currently benefiting from very high gas prices, but don't necessarily need it. We called it Pot Zero CFD, and it did feature in one of our Prime Minister's energy plans, and then it has been superseded in the couple of weeks later Prime Minister's different energy plans in favour of a windfall tax. The proposition was quite simple, and it runs along the lines thus. We have something in our mix of policy interventions already called a contract for difference for low carbon generators. The most recent rounds of contracts for different auctions, allocating CFDs to future renewables projects have cleared at something like £40 per megawatt hour. In the last few days, the electricity price has been up as high as £400 per megawatt hour and has typically been running in the region of £200 per megawatt hour. A large amount of older renewables have an older scheme payment called the renewables obligation, which pays them a subsidy on top of the wholesale price of electricity, which quite clearly at the moment they don't need. And our nuclear power stations are also benefiting from the high price. So our simple sounding, but perhaps more difficult in practice idea was to get the existing fleet of renewables, and if possible, at least the newest nuclear power station, onto a contract for difference at a long run price that's set well below prevailing market prices. And that would use existing policies to feed through to consumers the lower prices that we could get from renewables and nuclear than we can currently get from gas rather, which would have a side benefit for the generators that they get stable revenues. Now, the other ideas are in play. Across the EU, they've capped the wholesale prices paid to renewables generators at the moment. The Portuguese and the Spanish are subsidizing the production of electricity from gas to force down the wholesale price and benefit consumers. And there are various ideas in the conversation for the longer term about what's called a split market to try and separate the markets for renewables from the generation market for gas, most of which I don't think are viable. Whereas the contract for difference already exists. We have a de facto split market, and we could proceed in a relatively simple way to avoid the over-remuneration of nuclear and renewables, and to begin to break the link between gas prices and electricity prices that nobody minded about until gas got very, very expensive. I will stop there because I could be going on like the Duracell bunny on this topic for the rest of the afternoon.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, we're running out of time, so we have time for one more question. If you can.
I am Judah Sibo from Cranfield University. My question is directed to Emily. With regards to greenhouse gas removal technologies, the IPCC has repeatedly in the 5th assessment report and now the 6th one, clearly stated that it's an indispensable aspect in getting to net zero. But the nationally determined contributions of nations kind of indicate a very low intent to deploy this technology. I would like you to, if you could share insights, aside forestation and land use measures, not much regards to the other options. So I would like you to share insights on what probable reasons for this and what could be done to drive inclusion by various nations of the world, as well as the development of these technologies. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question and a really big one. You're absolutely spot on. It's not in the NDCs of the vast majority of countries, despite the fact that the IPCC definitely says we need it. And we're seeing in the vast majority of economies, we're seeing a massive, if you like, attitude behavior gap between the actions of governments in promoting carbon removal in their rhetoric and then in actually supporting it in their investments. With regard for how we push forward investments in this, I think that's slightly out of my comfort zone in terms of expertise. But I think there's been a lot of focus on afforestation and not a lot of focus on anything else. The problem that this does is it drives down the price of what we're seeing for these removals, right? And so I think that there's a real disconnect, as I said before, between this stuff that's kind of cheap and available, but also kind of quite risky, versus this stuff that's quite expensive and not very available, but also a lot easier to monitor and secure. I think that we are seeing a lot of action on the voluntary side, which certainly seems to be moving a lot faster than government policy. There is a huge demand for carbon credits, and there's huge interest, both from the kind of world of like venture capital, but also from the world of industries who seek to pay for carbon removals in order to meet their own net zero targets at company level. So this is people like Microsoft and so forth. And I know that in the EU, there's been recently a lot of talk of how to incentivize this and how to actually put it in the market, how to actually create a price for it. I think, you know, personally, I'm kind of sitting and watching and seeing what happens with the EU Commission, and seeing also what happens with the Inflation Reduction Bill in the US, which could really provide quite a lot of money towards this. Nick, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify as an IPCC author what the IPCC actually said. You're right. You were right in what you said, Emily. The IPCC was unequivocal about the need for carbon dioxide removal, but it was actually very, very equivocal about what type of carbon dioxide removal. And there are now plenty of studies, individual studies out there that show net zero without engineered CO2 removal is possible.
I feel like we've just opened a big can of worms.
Yeah.
However, we are going to end, unfortunately, because I guess that all I'd say is we're involved in academic debate. So thank you, Nick, for that. Thank you. If you just join us in thanking our speakers. And then if you want to come up and just introduce the next.
Yeah, thank you to Sarah and Amber and all of our panelists for that great final session for this conference. I've not been up here yet, but for anyone who hasn't met me, my name is Debbie Frogger and I'm with the TFI Network Plus. But I'm up here right now to introduce our final keynote speaker for this conference. And I'm very thrilled to be able to introduce Dr. Matthew Winning up onto stage. So Matthew is a senior research fellow at the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources, and he works primarily on climate policy and circular economy. Matt is also a passionate climate communicator and host of the BBC Radio 4 show, Net Zero, A Very British Problem. And he's also the author of the book Hot Mess, which I do recommend everybody have a look at. Matt is also a climate change comedian, so without further ado, I would like to invite up Matt. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Hello, wonderful to be here today. Thank you very much. This is the widest room I have ever had to talk to. So I'm going to try and keep eye contact at a sort of 90-degree angle here. I am, where's my slides? I am Dr. Matt Winning, and I've been asked to speak to you today, presumably because I am a researcher and have been for 10 years. And I'm also a climate change comedian, which is also it's a weird combination when you tell people that you do those two things. It's like finding out that someone is an estate agent and also like a really nice person. bit of a shock to the system, but it's a pleasure to be here today to talk to you about net zero at a stadium hosted, named after an airline run by a petrol state. Okay, so we're off. I am, so I'm a researcher. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a researcher. Worked at UCL on one of the world's leading institutes on sustainability and climate change, or as my dad likes to say, Matthew's 37 and still at university, as tends to be the case. But I am a comedian, and I've been doing comedy since the first year of my PhD. I started doing comedy as a way not to talk about climate change, as a way to sort of get out, because I think having something outside of your PhD is... Can we get a show of hands? Who in here's a PhD student? Yeah, most. Great, good to know. So I thought, having a PhD would be like an opening into a world of sophistication, and your life would change. The only thing that has literally changed in my life is that my family now have something to hit me over the head with when I do something idiotic. Like constantly, I'm leaving like my bags on the train, and my wife's always like, "But you have a PhD. How can you leave your bag on the train again?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't have a PhD and not leaving my bag on trains. What would that entail? And can I get some funding for it?" So I've been doing that. I did my PhD. I like to tell people I have a PhD in climate change policy, which means I'm the sort of doctor that if you do have a heart attack on a flight, I will rush to your side, but only to berate you for flying. So that's what I do. And then I've been doing comedy for 13 years now, and specifically for the last 5 of those on climate change. But just so you've got an idea of where I am, sort of the comedy industry, I'm the sort of comedian that's followed on Twitter by the European corrugated board industry. Yeah, that's my sort of target demographic. Worst thing about it, more followers than me. Yeah, and when I found that out, I wanted to walk directly into the sea, which will become increasingly easy over the coming decades. Yeah, that's the first climate change joke. Watch out, there might be a few more in there. Good, bit of a change of tone. I can see you guys are sort of like, this is a bit, it's not all going to be like this. This is just the first few minutes. This is what I go out and do, and I speak to the public, and I try and get them to engage with climate change using jokes, because it's a very depressing topic, and it's very difficult to get people to engage in something that's, even you guys are, and that was great. I thought it was a really good session and stuff, but it's hard to constantly be focused on these things. So that's why I go out and do this sort of stuff. So, what else should I say at this point in time up top? I think that's about it as an introduction. So I've been doing this, working as a researcher for 10 years. And I'll talk a little bit about my research. Basically, I'm going to go through 2 things. One is going to be just my career as a way of just giving you an example if you're a PhD student now and you're thinking about what might happen. And then I'll talk more about communication, which is probably a bit more interesting. So I'll try and skip the career stuff through that as quickly as possible. I finished my PhD in Also, what I'll say is I'll go through some of this, and I'll go through the highlights, and it'll seem good. But what I'm actually going to talk about far more is all my failures and mistakes. And most of you will have this presentation and go, right, I know what not to do if I'm going to work in research or work in this area. So I finished my PhD in 2012 and submitted it on the Thursday and started working as a researcher on the Monday. That's the first thing I would not advise. Yeah, if you have time to take a break at any point, take a break, yeah, and recharge your batteries and clear your head and get some energy, because it's really hard to constantly be doing stuff like this all the time, especially working on this topic, but also just doing a PhD in general or research in general is really tricky. So what did I do? Well, since working as a researcher, I've published papers. This was as part of UKERC phase 3, so the previous phase of UKERC, and I've been involved in UKERC phase 4 briefly as well. But we did this. I think I've left off. Yeah. And so some of the work for that, one of them was a book chapter. The first one was a book chapter. The second one was a paper, which It was then cited in the last IPCC report. It was used, went and presented at BAYS, used by the Committee on Climate Change as their sort of international basis. You know, so that was work that I've done as a researcher after a PhD that's fed into, you know, national and international policy making, and you know, that's good. You can achieve stuff, is what I'm saying, if you keep going down this route and keep doing stuff. And that feels good. I'm also an author on the Lancet Commission, Countdown, sorry, on health and climate change. I've been on 3 of those now the last 3 years, which is great, and it's basically one of the most cited climate change papers every year. We've had papers on climate finance as well, in investment traps in developing countries. I've had a PhD student of my own, which is by far the most rewarding thing, and he finished his PhD in 2018, and I did most of that myself. That was, you get, you know, different dynamics between supervisors and stuff like that. Everybody's is different. I had finished my PhD, and the following year was a supervisor and had to do most of it because the primary supervisor had lots of students and far too busy and stuff. But that journey was an incredible journey. My PhD student now works at the European Commission and is, you know, doing things far greater than myself. It's just this, you know, it's a thing that keeps going. It never, you know, the treadmill never really stops, but it's useful to speak to people along the way. And I've done things like, fed into policy on fighting climate change, OECD, and what I'm going to talk about in a little bit is this handbook on climate communication. So I've sort of moved into that area. Now, actual advice for you. First of all, I didn't publish a paper. So all of that sounds great. I didn't publish a paper for the first 3 or 4 years after starting as a researcher. Now, and you all come from very different backgrounds. None of my family are academics, right? I had no idea what academia involved, what it was really, what a career involved. The first paper that I ever published, I'm listed third in the paper, even though I was pretty much the first author, because I thought you were supposed to do it in alphabetical order, right? That's how naive I was as a PhD student, and nobody tells you anything in academia. You're just supposed to know things all the time. You're supposed to just know things and know how it works, and there's an assumption there, and it's really difficult. So ask questions, don't be afraid of making mistakes, and basically, you know, it takes time. So what I did then was, I went into my research position, and I have a unique position in the sense that I was also doing stand-up comedy like 3 or 4 nights a week during all this time, and had this other career, which you may or may not have other things to do. But you know, good to have a life. And so I wasn't even sure if I wanted to become an academic, but I took a position. I spent the first few years of that doing the work, going into work every day, doing the research. That was fine. Didn't publish anything for about 3 years because I didn't realize that you're basically expected to do it all in your spare time. I didn't have any spare time because I was already filling all of my spare time. And then some of the projects that I worked on, they didn't really work in a way which allowed, you know, the subject matter or whatever wasn't really publishable as such, or it would have been a lot of work to publish it, that sort of thing. So there's also sort of luck involved in what projects you get on. I've worked on, I think, 7 or 8 projects. We've published maybe 16 papers over that since the last decade since I've done research, academic papers that is. But it took time. It took a good like 4 years for me to work out how it all fitted together, and then to start publishing and to begin my career. So what I'm saying is, people all go at different rates, and it's advice that I've had from on comedy, but it's also advice that I would give you in academia as well, which is try to view your career as playing golf, right? In the sense that you're only ever trying to better your own score. Don't look at everyone else and how they're playing. Concentrate on yourself. And I think it's good advice for life. Concentrate on yourself and your own improvements and what you're doing, and that's how you get better. Because the other stuff's a distraction. It can really take away from furthering your own career and being focused and finding what it is that you're good at and what you do. So take your time, take breaks, and know that it takes different time for different people depending on what it is you want to do. Now, I work in this area because I'm interested in climate change, is the other thing to say. I don't, and as I say, I never wanted to be an academic, never really knew what academia was. And I felt that I could do more good, I think, or be more involved if I worked in academia, but that's not necessarily the case, so you have to be open to where it is you can, you know, have it, if what you're interested in is making a difference, then where is it you can make the biggest difference? And then combining that with what you're good at, what your skill set is, and what your interests are in. And if you can get those three things to interweave, and it took me, again, about 5 or 6 years to work that out until I was well into my 30s. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, the communication stuff. My biggest piece of advice, if you're a PhD student or an early career researcher, is to find a mentor, find someone who's experienced, who's not your line manager or your supervisor or someone else. Someone that is, you might not know them that well, but someone that you have had interactions with that you think is trustworthy and that you feel like you could talk to, that would be open and approachable. Find someone to speak to. It's invaluable, I think, to have someone that has an outside eye on your career, that has the experience to do something, to help you, essentially. And you'll be surprised. So many academics are you know, genuinely very passionate about helping the next generation through, and I find myself doing that as well. So yeah, that, if you take anything away from all of this, that's my what else happens? You get asked to, you just have to do lots of things, and it's a real balance. It's a real balance when to say yes and when to say no to things in life, and especially in academia, because again, there's assumptions and nobody tells you whether you're allowed to say yes or allowed to say no, and that takes time to figure out as well. So, you know, it is, I guess, an industry and an area where saying yes to things can really be helpful, but if it's not directly, you know, directly what you want to do, occasionally you're going to have to say no to things just to give yourself the space to work on the things that you want to do. Because if you do say yes to things, people will just be like, great, I'm going to ask that person the next time, and again and again and again, and all of a sudden you find yourself just being that person, and you're 10 years in and you don't really know what it is you want to do. Networking is the other big piece of advice, which is this. So this is great, and keep contact with these people, and if this happens every year, fantastic. I think this is invaluable because this is exactly how academic careers are built, through networks, through working with others. And you know, I can't say anything highly enough about things like this, if I'm honest. Which is why I came and spoke. I get asked to do stuff like this several times a week on top of my job. And it's really difficult balance. And I would have loved to have been here yesterday, but I now have a 2-year-old child that I need to be at home on a Wednesday night, so that there's another thing to balance in there. And life is difficult, and you have to have that life. So, but I'm really happy to be able to come and speak today because I think it's, you know, if a handful of you listen to me, then that's job done. And another piece of advice is, be yourself and look after yourself. And I think that's invaluable in whatever you do, but especially in academia, because it is about you and your skill set and what you can bring and who you are as a person and your strengths. So that's all the career stuff. I'm going to talk about communication for however long we've got. So I do, there we go. I do lots of, basically I started doing comedy during my PhD in the evenings as a way to get out the house, to not think about my PhD, right? And that continued for about 8 years. And then in 2017, and I had this weird other semi-professional career as a comedian around the UK. And then I was about to give up, and I decided I was going to try and do a show about climate change, because I thought, why not? I'll give it a shot. Something that I know about, it'll be interesting. And I did that. In fact, that one on the left, the one on the left is me, much younger. That was a month, No, yeah, a month after I submitted my PhD, I was also in the final of the BBC New Comedy Awards, which is like the best new comedians in the UK, right? And I wasn't talking about climate change, it was just like jokes. But that was my odd, I just mean that was, I had a very odd thing which was happening, and you might have your own odd thing, you might not, that's absolutely fine. But yeah, 2017 I decided to start talking about climate change, and since then I now predominantly do comedy about climate change, and I work only 4 days a week at the university now, and I do a day on comedy, and I speak to people across, and I'll talk about that in a second. And I do jokes about how, you know, for instance, the impacts of climate change, like this graph, show that the planet is going to get squashed and go sort of weird colours, and there's going to be 6 of them. And I talk about things like, you know, renewables and what we're achieving. This is going to be the largest wind farm in the world. The size of these are each, there's 600 of them been built in the UK. They're going to be the size of the Eiffel Tower, and each blade is roughly the size of 47 Chewbaccas. You know, the scale of these things are massive. Or if you prefer, Imperial. There you go, some jokes, Star Wars jokes, that's your level. Good to know. Anyway, so I go about and talk about this, and from that, basically, I had a passion and I started doing it, and I took time out of my career, you know, not doing all other stuff, and then I got asked to write a book, and I posted a couple of radio series, and I've been on TV, and there's a big list of all the newspapers and things and TV shows and live events I've done over the last little while. And it's pretty constant, and now I get asked to talk at things like this because I've talked at other things, and it sort of snowballs. And communication, I think, around climate change is really important, and I sort of agree with Emily's point before about this idea of the information deficit problem. If we just give people information, they won't necessarily act. And I agree with that, but from doing this and actually being one of the people that go up and talk to the public and speak to people and try to understand, the public's very nuanced, right? So there's actually lots of different types of people across the entire spectrum, and you're talking to lots of different people. And some people I talk to do change their behaviour and tell me about it. And I'm not expecting everybody to change. You know, it's not that there's one coherent thing and everybody's going to change and it's all going to be fine because of what I do. But if I talk to people, it's the same as this. If I talk to people, and a handful of people in the audience here take away a few things and remember something and go, right, get a mentor at some point, and then they decide to do that and it helps their career. And, you know, there is change happens from the ground up. So I don't think it's this idea that there's this, you know, I go out and I talk to people about climate change and everyone will just change their behaviour and it'll be fine. But what happens is some people make changes, and I've had people say that they sold their car after coming to see my show, families getting in contact being like, we didn't fly last year. More importantly, other people saying that, you know, that people that were on the edge of becoming engaged in stuff might tip them over, right? And they joined whatever, Friends of the Earth, you know, become like actively involved in things. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who are not interested, who maybe would never have gone to a talk or read a book about climate change, but then do, and just feel a bit more informed. And that's also important, is to bring people in ways that they haven't previously been engaged in climate change. And it's similar to what Emily's talking about, because part of the things that are successful, so things like the Citizens' Assembly, it does require them, you know, these citizens get together and talk about it, but they do actually learn a bit about climate change so that they have more understanding to then be able to be involved and make the decisions. So the learning process, I think, is important. You can't make informed decisions unless you feel part of it, but also you have to have a level of knowledge to be able to be involved. And we need to speak to people on their levels. That's the other thing that I would advise. We need to talk to people where they already are. So academia assumes that we create something and we'll put out a message and people will pay attention to it. And that is not the case at all. And you have to actually actively communicate, and universities are atrocious at that, if I'm honest. It's an afterthought, and it's often not part of projects, it's often not part of career development, it's not part of what people want to do. The way people involve it. And there's lots of individuals that are very supportive, or even, you know, institutes, but at a high level, academia is pretty bad at that. So I'll just talk to you briefly. The first bit of funding that I've had to actually talk about communication and stuff was putting together a handbook this year. And just some highlights from that I'll give you just now. First of all, if you are going to do communication, what is your role? There's lots of different roles we can play here. Are you a specific expert? Are you just an informed member of the public? Are you advocating for something? Understanding what your role is and what it is you're trying to achieve, and making sure that everyone in the audience or whoever you're speaking to are aware of that's quite important. And it's also really important to convey genuine and authentic communication. So yeah, essentially the same thing as before. Be yourself. Make it clear the capacity you're speaking in, but absolutely be authentic and talk about yourself. Hence why I've just come up and talked about my life and things that are happening to me and other things, and hopefully people become a bit engaged, because people are interested in people. The simplest way of putting it. People aren't interested in energy sources or other things. You know, occasionally people are, but they are you guys, nerds, right? But most people are not, and people are interested in other people and their stories, right? And that's what we need to be telling, whether that's climate impacts or whether that's the stories of change that we're seeing. So knowing your audience is really important. So understanding who it is you're speaking to, if you're doing communication, what makes them tick. There's a good example of a climate communicator in the US, Catherine Hale, if you aren't aware of her, she's really good, she's got a book as well. She talks about going to an organization to speak about climate change and changing her entire presentation to fit into the presentation's like 4 rules or whatever it is of the club, the Rotary Club. So you know, it's just thinking about your audience and not expecting them to come to you, but you trying to go to them in a way that will speak to them as people. And again, other people are not a blank slate. That's the other thing. It's very much that information deficit thing. Is people have pre-existing values, and you know, different bits of information can just reinforce those values. So listings are a massively important role. In terms of the content, try and make it people-centric. So make humans part of the words and the images that you show. Talk about locality to the people that you're speaking to and give examples of locality. You know, statistics, high-level things are not, you know, 2 degrees. Most people don't have a clue what that means, or 1.5 degrees or 4. I don't think it has an idea what that means. Talk about the physical changes that are happening at that temperature. And stories are the other ones. So if you've got stories, whatever the story is, it can be as simple as complicated as you want. Stories are the way that most people make sense of things. And so including that's really important. And then just some tips, rehearsing, talk to people, get feedback, again, connect with people in here and other colleagues. Make eye contact. I've tried to talk to everybody in the room if possible, but it's quite difficult. If somebody asks a question, repeat the question back. This is just a really basic bit of advice, because maybe not everyone in the room has heard the question, and it gives you time to think about what you're talking about. Yeah, expect questions, especially if you work in this area, you'll be asked questions about everything by everybody, right? And it's difficult because you become an expert and a PhD in one area, and then people expect you to know about absolutely everything about climate change or net zero when you talk to them. That's tricky. It's tricky, and be clear about what you do and don't know, but also, you know, you probably know more than most, so you can talk about these things. Try to be approachable and open for further questions. I am taking no further questions after this. No, I think we've got time for a couple of questions. Is that okay? Yeah. And yeah, and basically, if you are going to do communication and talks and other things, again, during your PhD or elsewhere, do it again and again and again and again and again until it's, there's no difference between me being off and on stage now. I'm on stage so much that I stopped caring about it. So, there you go. Thank you very much. I've been Matt Winning. It's my book. You can very much plug in my book at the end of things if you're interested. And you can, yeah, find me elsewhere. But I'm happy to take some questions for 2 questions. 2 questions. We have one over here, and we have one over here. I hope that was okay. I was only here for the last session, so I don't actually hopefully we hadn't covered all of that before. Not the jokes bit, but some of the content.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for that. That was really interesting. It was really good to see like what you had to say about communication. Obviously, you've done like in your role as an academic, but also in other engagements. So some of the tips at the end about making it local to people and stories. Obviously, you can see that being in public engagement, but I'm curious how you think that translates to like traditional academic settings. So for example, an academic conference, if you go as like a poster presentation or an oral presentation, do you think that's something that you can also translate? Do you think the academic world is like ready for that kind of communication, or do you think you need to be more formal?
It's a really good question, because there's that sort of weird balance of like the tradition. So all of my lectures that I give, not that I do much teaching, again, that's a weird thing where I do lots of research and almost no teaching, because academia is not, that's a position that I have. So even though I've got all this experience of talking to people, I'm not employed to do that. So anyway, and apologies if people are just trying to follow the Scottish accent for the last half an hour. I realise that could have been tricky. Yeah, can you apply those tools to presenting at a conference, is what you're asking. So I think, one, it's about knowing your audience. So in a way, you're already going, well, I know that academics will be interested more in the methodology or whatever it is. So I don't think you have to do anywhere near as much of that personalizing it. But I mean, one thing that really bothers me about academia is that everybody's always like, I came up with this question, and then I did this methodology that's in 2 slides, and then these are the results. And you're like, it took 2 years. There must have been some story in there about what went wrong. People aren't interested in what went right. People are interested in what went wrong and why it was bad. That's all we all want, is juicy stories like that, right? So you can expand upon things about what you've done, personalizing it, making it a little bit more interesting. I think the journey that you went on, what did you do that you wouldn't have done again? You know, those sorts of things often aren't talked about in academia. So I think that's a good starting point. But again, having the confidence to do that's difficult, because you're being vulnerable and showing your own failure. I think that's important. And then the other aspect about, like, can you essentially give local stories or other things? Yeah, I think if you're going to a conference somewhere specific and there's a story about that place, you're positioning it in the here and now. I think that's really good. It's very difficult because, again, you don't know who is in the audience. So you might be giving an example of a local story to you, but you're in Bogota with people from all over the world who've come to talk or whatever, and they've all got different experiences. So academia is quite tricky because you have a very international audience. Not everybody's references are all exactly the same. So trying to tell stories and do stuff like that can be quite difficult. It's a lot easier for me to come to Manchester and do a show and know that almost everyone's going to be from Manchester than it is to speak at an academic conference. So it isn't easy, but I think there's things that you can try to do. Yeah, we have one over here.
Thank you. Great talk. I want to ask about communication. Besides just like informing people and educating them, how do you get them to like act on like specific things, like not, for instance, to put pressure on the government for them to not pull the CCS funding like they did in 2015, which set us back all the way to here. So specifics.
So it depends what type of communication it is you're doing. So the question, sorry, in case anyone hadn't heard, was how do you get people to act when you do communication? How do you get them to become more involved, say, in the politics of what's involved? The simple answer is you can't, because people are individual, autonomous decision makers and will do whatever it is. All you can do is present information in a convincing way that tries to make it the easiest for people to take action and then let them do what they want. Because trying to tell people what to do doesn't really work. So it's tricky. You have to You have to lower your expectations about what you're achieving from communication. What you want to do is you want people to take away a couple of very simple things that they will either remember, pieces of information, or very simple actions that they can take. And I often basically I do these shows and they're tend to be about an hour long, 40 minutes, something like that. And I'll always at the end put something about one thing that they can do. So one of the shows was changing your energy provider. Then the next show that I did was about signing a petition to, at the time it was 2018, so it was a petition about banning petrol and diesel cars by 2030 instead of whatever 2040 it was at the time. Then something, so if you're doing a piece of communication, I think it's good to give people clear actions to take away if you can. Because that's what people are mostly missing. They're missing the agency to make change. But even just explaining to people what types of actions they can take is an important thing to do. But you literally can't control what it's amazing. Right, I once did a show where I talked about lots of individual things, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the show, there's often people come up and ask questions. There was a queue of about 15 people on the last day of what had been done 25 shows in a row at the Edinburgh Fringe. The last day, there was a queue of people, and someone came up and they said, so if I do, and I talked in the show weirdly about how many dogs I would have to kill a year if I wanted to have like a carbon neutral child, right? It's a stupid idea. But so someone at the end came up and went, so thanks for that, it was great, I really enjoyed that, but if I never fly again, and if I don't have children, if I don't drive, and if I go vegan, how many dogs could I have? And my point is, you can't control what information that people take away from what you say. It can get mistranslated, people have their own preconceptions. But again, that's not a sign that it's not working for other people. It's just everybody's different. So hopefully that sort of answers your questions with a story about, a very dark story about dogs. Okay, thank you very much. Happy Matt winning. Cheers.